Taking the night air on Boston Harbor was sharp with salt and smoke. Lanterns swung from the masts of merchant vessels, their reflections breaking across the black water like scattered shards of fire. Charles Davis stood barefoot on the deck of the small brig Pollyann, his hands raw from hauling lines all day. He was only 13, yet the sea had already carved its lessons into his body, the sting of rope burns, the ache in the shoulders, and the constant hunger of a boy who grew too fast for the scraps he earned. Charles had no father to speak of, and his mother, a washerwoman, could not feed 3 mouths alone. At 12, he had begged passage on the brig, offering his strength in return for food, a hammock, and the promise of a sailor's wage one day. The sea frightened him, but it also gave him something solid: discipline, rhythm, a place to stand, where no landlord's knock could drive him away. That night, as the crew of the Pollyann prepared to leave the harbor for a run of timber up the Maine coast, Charles noticed a darker shape slipping into the channel. A warship. Its sails loomed like a mountain of cloth, its sides bristling with guns that caught the moonlight. The sailors around Charles went quiet. Everyone knew the shape of a British frigate. The War of 1812 was over, but not its habits. The Royal Navy, hungry for men, had never stopped the practice of impressment, stopping American ships and taking sailors they claimed were deserters from the crown. Age did not matter. Citizenship did not matter. If you were strong enough to pull a rope, you were strong enough for His Majesty's service. "Keep your head down, boy," whispered old Merrick, the cook, as the British ship drew near. But Charles could not help. Staring lanterns flared along the frigate's deck, revealing rows of men in long coats and flat hats. They looked like shadows lined up in judgment. A voice boomed across the water, ordering the Pollyann to heave to. The brig's captain cursed under his breath but obeyed. Resistance meant cannon fire, and no merchant vessel could survive a broadside. The British boarded swiftly, their boots striking the wood in unison. Charles shrank back against the rail, heart hammering, as an officer scanned the crew. He was tall, pale, with a voice that carried like a whip. "Names and papers," he demanded. One by one the men stepped forward. Some argued, insisting they were American-born. Others begged. Then the officer's eyes landed on Charles and this one. "A cabin boy," the captain said quickly. "Barely 13, he's no sailor." The officer studied him, as if weighing rope and canvas in his mind. "He has 2 arms, 2 legs, that makes him a sailor enough." Charles felt hands seize his shoulders. He thrashed, kicking out, but the grip was iron. Old Merrick shouted, "Leave the lad. He's no deserter, he's just a child." A musket butt slammed into Merrick's ribs, dropping him to his knees. Silence. The officer said. Charles cried out for his mother then, though he knew she could not hear him. The harbor was wide, the city dark behind its lamps. His voice was small against the creak of rigging and the slap of waves. He was dragged across the deck, his bare feet scraping the planks, and thrust into the waiting boat. As the frigate loomed closer, its sails black against the stars, Charles felt something break inside him. He was no longer a boy from Boston. He was property of the crown, swallowed by the war machine of a nation not his own. On the frigate's deck, he was forced to stand before 2 lines of sailors. They stared at him with hard, unreadable faces, their shadows long under the lanterns. The boy felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The officer's voice rang out again. "Welcome aboard His Majesty's ship. You will serve, boy, and you will learn quickly. Pray you do not learn the hard way." The lines of sailors closed in around him. The smell of tar, sweat, and salt pressed into his lungs. Charles Davis, that stood alone under the gaze of the Empire, a child caught in a game of nations he did not understand, and so began his captivity. The hard lesson. The frigate groaned and shifted as it caught the wind, pulling away from Boston Harbor. Charles stood pressed against the rail, his hands tied in front of him, staring helplessly as the lights of his city faded into the black. The lanterns that once guided sailors home now glimmered like far-off stars, slipping behind the horizon. He clenched his jaw, fighting tears. Sailors did not cry, not where others could see. "Move, boy," a rough voice barked. A shove from behind sent Charles stumbling across the deck. He was herded toward a ladder leading below. The air grew thicker as he descended, heavy with tar, sweat, and the stench of unwashed men. Hammocks swung from beams, and sailors lounged or mended clothes by lantern light. Every face turned toward him. Some looked away quickly, others stared. "Fresh meat," muttered a man with missing teeth. A wiry sailor with scars across his knuckles leaned forward. "How old are you, lad?" Charles lifted his chin. 13, the man snorted. 13, and you'll be worked like you're 30. Best learn quick, or you'll be dead before your next birthday. He introduced himself as Reeve, a pressed man like Charles, though older. "Don't think you're special. Half this crew was stolen off their own decks, same as you. The king doesn't care if you're American, Irish, or devil himself. If you've got hands, you belong to the Navy." Charles listened, sick to his stomach. His thoughts ran to his mother, to the little room she rented in Boston's North End. He imagined her waiting for him to return from the timber run, not knowing her boy had been stolen. the image cut like a knife. That first night, he was given a hammock, though he barely slept. The constant creak of wood, the groan of ropes, and the reek of men kept his eyes open. When sleep came, it was broken by dreams of water swallowing him whole. At dawn, the work began. A boatswain's whistle shrieked, and men scrambled from their hammocks like startled rats. Charles followed, his legs clumsy. He was handed a line thicker than his wrist and ordered to haul with the others. The rope bit into his palms, reopening the raw skin he had earned on the Polly Ann. He gritted his teeth, trying to keep pace with the men faster. "Boy," the boatswain snapped, striking his shoulder with a rope's end. The sting brought tears, but Charles refused to cry out. He pulled until his arms shook and his chest burned. The day blurred into endless tasks: decks with salt water, hauling buckets, running messages between officers. Every mistake was punished with a cuff or a lash of rope. His stomach growled, but meals were nothing more than hard biscuit and salted meat, tough as leather. Rats scurried freely, bold enough to steal crumbs from a boy too tired to chase them away. By evening, his body trembled from exhaustion. He slumped against the rail, gazing out at the rolling sea. The horizon stretched endless, no land in sight. The frigate was a prison without walls, and he was trapped inside it. Reeve found him there. "Hurts, don't it?" he said quietly, nodding to Charles's blistered hands. "Hurts worse the second day. But you'll live. We all do." Charles looked up at him, bitterness rising. "I never wanted this. I didn't choose it." Reeve's expression softened. "None of us did. But choice doesn't count here. Only survival does. Learn the ropes, do your work, and maybe you'll see home again. Defy them." He glanced toward the quarterdeck where officers paced like hawks, and "They'll break you." That night, Charles lay awake in his hammock, the ship rocking beneath him. He thought of Boston again, of his mother's voice calling him in from the street, of the smell of bread from the baker's shop down the lane. He pressed his face into his sleeve to hide the sound of his sobs. Above him, footsteps echoed on the deck somewhere. A lantern swung, casting shadows that rocked with the ship. Charles realized with dread that every day forward would be like this, one harder, crueler, and farther from home. But deep inside, a small spark refused to die. He swore to himself that he would not let them break him. He would endure. And one day, when the chance came, he would find his way back across the sea. For now, though, he was a child in the belly of an empire, learning the hard lesson of survival. At sea, blood and salt. The days on the frigate fell into a rhythm of misery. Whistles shrieked at dawn, orders barked, bodies bent to labor. Charles's world shrank to rope, tar, salt water, and bruises. His palms blistered and bled, the salt stinging every open cut. At night, when the men collapsed into hammocks, Charles often lay awake, staring at the dark beams above, listening to the endless creak of wood and the sigh of the sea. By the end of his first week, he had learned the basics: how to coil rope properly, how to scrub the deck until it gleamed, how to climb the rigging without freezing halfway up. Bosun showed no patience. A mistake meant a cuff across the ear or a rope's end across the back. Charles's shoulders carried welts, but he swallowed his anger, repeating Reeve's words: "Survive first, resist later." On the 8th morning, the lesson turned harsher. The frigate had been running northward along the New England coast, looking for merchant ships. The horizon was gray, the sea restless, when the cry went up from the masthead: "Sail ho!" Every man stirred, energy rippling through the crew. Officers strode across the deck, shouting orders. The sails adjusted, the frigate leaned into the wind, and soon another vessel appeared ahead, a small American schooner, its sails white against the stormy sky. The taking, Charles felt his stomach drop. He thought of the Polly Ann, of how easily she had been taken. The schooner didn't stand a chance. The frigate closed the distance, cannons run out, though they never fired. The schooner hove to, surrendering, before a shot was fired. A boarding party was prepared. To Charles's horror, he was ordered to join them. "You'll learn your trade today, boy," the boatswain growled, shoving a cutlass into his hands. The blade was heavy, awkward in his small grip. The boat lowered, and Charles found himself rowing across the swells with hardened sailors around him. The schooner grew larger, its crew huddled on deck, faces pale. Charles recognized the same fear that had seized him days before. The boarding was swift. Officers demanded papers, names, nationalities. Charles hung back, clutching the cutlass, though his arm shook. He watched as sailors were dragged aside, accused of desertion, their protests ignored. One man, no older than 17, cried out that he was American-born, that he had never seen England. His words earned him a blow across the mouth. "Take him," the officer ordered. The boy was forced into the boat with the others. His eyes met Charles's, wide and desperate, as if to ask why a fellow youth was holding a weapon against him. Charles looked away, shame burning hot in his chest. When they returned to the frigate, the captured men were shoved below, pressed into the crew like cattle added to a herd. Charles followed, the cutlass still in his hand, sticky with the sweat of his palms. He wanted to throw it overboard, but he knew better. Disobedience meant punishment, and punishment here was brutal. That evening, Charles sat in the shadow of a gun deck, his stomach heavy with guilt. Reeve joined him, chewing on a scrap of biscuit. "Don't look so sick, lad," Reeves said. "Better him than you. You want to be on the other end of that rope." "He was my age," Charles muttered. "He didn't do anything." Reeves' eyes were tired, older than his years. "None of us did." "You think I wanted this?" He lifted his sleeve, showing scars across his arm, pale lines from lashes. "But choice is a thing left on the shore. Out here you do what keeps you breathing. Remember that." Charles nodded, though his heart resisted the lesson. That night, as he lay in his hammock, he thought of the boy's eyes, the terror in them. He wondered if his own eyes had looked the same when the British took him. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was filled with dark dreams of waves closing over his head, of rows of sailors standing in silence, of cutlasses flashing in lantern light. The sea was changing him. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his hands tightened on ropes, in the way his mind learned to swallow fear. But some part of him still clung to the boy he had been in Boston. Some part still whispered that this life was wrong, and that he must find a way home before the sea and the crown swallowed him completely. For now, though he was caught between two truths, he was still a child, yet already a prisoner of empire, and the ocean showed no mercy to either. The lash weeks passed, and the frigate carried Charles farther from everything he knew. The routines grew familiar, though never easier. His hands hardened, his shoulders thickened, and his boyish frame began to show the strain of a sailor's life. Yet no amount of endurance could prepare him for the punishments that ruled the ship. Discipline was the spine of the Royal Navy. Every man knew the articles of war, and every man feared the lash. Whippings were not whispered threats but public spectacles, reminders to all that the crown's authority was carved into flesh. Charles first saw it one bleak morning, when the crew was ordered to muster on deck. Rain slicked the planks, and the sky was low with storm clouds. A sailor named Hobbs had been caught stealing rum. The officers wasted no time. He was tied to the grating, shirt stripped, back bared to the air. 50 lashes. The captain declared, his voice carried without need of shouting. The boatswain's mate stepped forward with the cat-o'-nine tails, the leather cords stiffed with dried blood. Charles clenched his fists as the first strike landed. Hobbs cried out, his back splitting. Under the cords, blood spattered across the deck. The second blow came, then the third, each one punctuated by a groan or a scream. Charles wanted to turn away, but the boatswain's eyes swept the crew, daring anyone to flinch. So he stared, his stomach twisting, as Hobbs sagged against the ropes. By the 50th lash, the man was barely conscious, his back a ruin of blood and torn flesh. The crew was dismissed as if nothing had happened. Hobbs was carried below, his fate uncertain. Charles stumbled back to his work. The image burned into his mind. That night, he lay in his hammock, trembling. He had thought he knew fear when they dragged him from the Polly Ann. But this was something deeper. It was the knowledge that his body, too, could be made an example. His first brush with punishment came not long after the frigate was running hard before a storm, the sea boiling black beneath the wind. Charles was ordered aloft to reef the topsail, a task he had done before but never in weather so fierce. He climbed the ratlins, the ship pitching violently beneath him. Rain lashed his face, blinding him, and his fingers slipped on the wet ropes. "Move by," someone shouted from below. He tried, but the sail snapped like a beast in the wind, tearing itself from his grip. Panic surged. For a heartbeat, he nearly let go, the drop yawning beneath him. Somehow he caught the line again, clinging for dear life. But the delay cost the crew precious minutes. When he reached the deck, soaked and shaking, the boatswain was waiting. "Useless whelp," the man snarled. He struck Charles across the face with a rope's end, the blow knocking him to his knees. "You think the king feeds you to play games in the rigging? You'll learn, or you'll die." Charles staggered to his feet, cheeks burning with shame. The crew watched, silent. Some looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. Others smirked. Only Reeve offered the faintest shake of his head, as if to say, "Keep quiet. Take it. Survive." That night, Charles sat hunched in the dim glow of a lantern, his face swollen, his spirit heavy. The sea had stripped away the last illusions of boyhood. He was not a cabin boy anymore. He was a sailor under the lash, bound to rules he had never chosen. Yet anger smoldered beneath the fear. He thought of Hobbs bleeding on the deck, of the cutlass shoved into his own hands during the boarding, of the rope across his face. Each memory was a scar carved inside him. The British could beat him, they could work him, they could starve him, but they could not make him forget who he was. He was Charles Davis, son of Boston, and he would not belong to them forever still. The frigate sailed on, indifferent to his vow. The sea stretched endless, and the lash ruled every man aboard. For Charles, survival meant more than strength. It meant patience. It meant watching for the crack in the wall, the one chance to turn anger into escape. That chance had not yet come, but it would. Bonds in the dark. The frigate had been at sea for nearly 2 months when Charles began to realize he was no longer alone. Survival had sharpened him, but it also taught him to notice the quiet bonds that formed among the pressed men. These were not friendships in the way boys shared at home, over games in alleyways or shared meals. They were alliances born of hardship, the kind that kept men alive under the lash. One evening, while scrubbing the gun deck, Charles caught Reeves' voice low and careful behind a coil of rope. "Keep your head down, and you'll live long enough to seaport." The words were not meant for Charles. Reeve was speaking to another sailor, lanky Irishman named Callahan, who had been taken from a merchant ship weeks before. Charles pretended not to listen, but his ears burned. There was something in Reeves' tone, a weight behind it, that suggested more than simple advice. Later that night, when the hammock swayed in the stale air below decks, Reeve leaned close to Charles. "You've a sharp eye, lad," he whispered. "Don't waste it. Learn who you can trust, and keep your mouth shut around the rest." Charles nodded, unsure what answer was expected. He wanted to ask what Reeve meant, but the look in the man's eyes stopped him. Secrets carried weight here, and weight could sink a boy fast. Days bled into one another. The ship chased seized cargo, and pressed more unwilling men into service. Each boarding twisted Charles's stomach, for he knew the faces of fear too well. The crew swelled with captives who cursed under their breath in a dozen tongues. One night, Charles was roused from his hammock by a hand on his shoulder. It was Callahan. "Come," he whispered. "Quiet." Charles followed, heart pounding, through the shadows of the lower deck. They slipped past sleeping bodies, ducked under ropes, and came to a small compartment near the stern, dimly lit by a smuggled lantern. Half a dozen men were there, Eve among them. They looked up as the boy entered. "He's young," one muttered. "He's sharp," Reeve countered. "And sharpness lasts longer than brawn." Charles swallowed hard. "What is this?" Reeve leaned forward, voice low. "It's the truth, lad. Men like us don't stay prisoners forever. We bide our time. We watch, and when the chance comes, we take it." Charles's eyes widened. "Escape." A murmur of warning ran through the group. Callahan glanced toward the hatch. "Not so loud, boy. That word can hang a man." Reeve nodded. "Aye, but you're not wrong. We've all thought it. Some of us dream of running when the ship anchors. Others whisper of turning the ship itself." Charles stared. The idea of seizing a warship seemed madness, yet in their eyes he saw the fire of men who had nothing left to lose. "You'll say nothing of this," Reeve warned, his tone sharp. "Not to friend, not to foe. You breathe a word, and you doom us all. Understand?" Charles nodded quickly. His heart hammered in his chest, but alongside the fear, something else stirred hope. However faint, however fragile it was hope. The meeting broke apart, each man drifting back into the shadows. Charles climbed into his hammock, his mind racing. He thought of Boston, of his mother's face, of the streets he longed to walk again. Could it be possible? Could men like Reeve and Callahan truly find a way to break the chains of the crown? The following day brought no hint of rebellion. Orders were shouted, sails trimmed, decks scrubbed. Yet every glance from Reeve carried a hidden message. Every brush of Callahan's shoulders seemed deliberate. Charles began to see the ship differently, only as a prison, but as a stage upon which something might yet unfold. Still, danger lurked in every shadow. The officers trusted no one. Whispers of mutiny had hanged men before, and the Cateau Ninetails waited eagerly for any excuse. Charles forced himself to mask his thoughts, to work as though nothing had changed. But inside, he felt a shift. For the first time since being dragged from the Polly Ann, he no longer felt entirely powerless. He was part of something, however secret, however dangerous. And though the sea still stretched endless around him, Charles began to believe there might one day be an end to it, that the boy torn from Boston's shore might yet find his way home. The officers eyed the frigate plowed eastward into colder waters, its sails swollen with Atlantic wind. Charles worked harder now, his body lean and wiry, his face thinner, older. He was not yet 14, but hardship had carved him into something different from the boy who once carried buckets for a Boston cook. He belonged to the rhythm of the sea, though his heart clung fiercely to land. Yet with every day, the secret fire below deck grew hotter. The whispered talks with Reeve and Callahan sharpened Charles's sense of watching, waiting. He noticed who among the pressed men scowled at orders, who clenched their fists when the lash was raised, who muttered in their sleep of home. He also noticed who seemed too eager, too willing to run to the officers for favor. Those men were poisoned. One of them was Blakely. Blakely was a lean Englishman with hollow cheeks and a sly grin. He had been pressed months earlier, but unlike others, he had been quickly, doing the officers' bidding with a zeal that made the crew despise him. Blakely's eyes were always sharp, always watching. Charles could feel them like a thorn in his side. One evening while Charles scrubbed the deck near the forecastle, Blakely sauntered close. "You've been keeping late company, boy," he murmured, his voice oily. "Don't think I haven't seen you slip off at night. Little lanterns burning where no lanterns should." Charles froze, his heart pounding. He kept scrubbing, forcing his voice to sound careless. "I don't know what you mean." Blakely smirked. "Aye, you do. Careful with your friends. Boy secrets sink faster than lead." Then he strolled off, leaving Charles with a chill that sank deeper than the sea spray on his skin. That night, in the shadows below deck, Charles told Reeve what had happened. Reeve's jaw tightened. "Blakely's a rat," he said, "and rats run to the cheese when they smell it." He'll talk if he thinks it'll earn him rum. What do we do? Charles asked. Reeves' eyes darkened. We keep our mouths shut. We wait, and if the rat squeals, we deal with him. But the danger was not only Blakely. An officer named Lieutenant Harrow had begun to notice Charles more often. Harrow was not like the captain, who barked orders from a distance. He was young, sharp-eyed, and cruel in quieter ways. He took a particular interest in breaking spirits. One morning, Harrow called Charles forward as the crew hauled lines. "You there, boy? Davis, isn't it?" Depp, smartly. Charles obeyed, standing before him with salt still dripping from his hair. "You've learned your ropes quickly," Harrow said, circling him. "But quick learners sometimes think themselves cleverer than they are. I've seen you watching, listening. A boy with eyes like that could be dangerous." Charles swallowed hard. "I only do as I'm told, sir." Harrow's smile was thin. "See that it stays that way?" He dismissed Charles, but the warning lingered like a noose. That night, Charles lay awake, the lantern light swaying Reeves, whispered promises of escape colliding with Harrow's cold gaze. 2 days later, Hobbs, the man who had once felt the lash tide of fever, his body was sewn into canvas and slid overboard, the sea swallowing him without ceremony. Charles stood at the rail as the bundle sank, his stomach twisting. Hobbs had survived the lash but not the sickness that festered in the damp air below deck. It was a stark reminder. The sea claimed men in many ways. As the crew dispersed, Charles caught Blakely whispering to Harrow near the quarterdeck. The officer's eyes flicked briefly toward Charles before turning away. Charles felt heat rise in his chest. The rat had squealed. That evening, when the men gathered in their secret corner, Reeves' face was grave. "Blakely's been talking," he said. The officers smelled unrest. A heavy silence followed. Callahan cursed under his breath. "Then we're done for." "No," Reeves said. His gaze swept the group, lingering on Charles. "We're not done, but the time for whispers may be ending. If they come for us, we'll need to choose them to the lash or rise." Charles felt the weight of the words press onto his shoulders. He was only 13, yet every choice seemed older than his years. The sea had stripped away childhood, leaving him standing on a line between fear and defiance. As the lantern burned low, he whispered to himself the vow he had made long ago. "I will not let them break me." But now, he wondered, would he live long enough to keep that vow? The breaking point, the frigate pressed eastward into the open Atlantic, chasing shadows of merchant sails across the horizon. The wind carried salt and chill, and with it an air of suspicion. Every man on board could feel an unease that clung heavier than damp clothes. Charles worked silently, eyes down, but his mind was restless. Lieutenant Harrow's warning still echoed in his ears, and Blakely's smirk haunted every corner. Of the deck the rat had spoken. Of that Charles was certain. The officers' glances lingered longer now, weighing the crew as if hunting for the spark of mutiny. One gray morning, the boatswain's whistle shrieked, calling the men to muster. Charles felt the shift before it was spoken. Something was coming. The captain stood tall, his coat buttoned to the throat, his voice calm but cutting. "Discipline is the marrow of this ship," he declared, "and I will not tolerate whispers of disobedience." A murmur rippled through the crew. Charles's stomach dropped. The words were aimed like arrows. 2 Marines dragged a man forward. It was Callahan. His wrists were bound, his face pale. Charles's chest tightened. "This man," the captain said, "has been accused of plotting unrest. Whether true or not is immaterial. The articles of war are clear. Suspicion alone is enough to warrant punishment." The crew stiffened. They all knew what punishment meant. 50 lashes, the captain ordered. Callahan's eyes darted through the crowd, finding Charles for a fleeting moment. There was no plea, no words, just the heavy truth of what waited for them all. He was tied to the grating, his back bared to the cold air. The boatswain's mate stepped forward with the cat-o'-nine-tails. The first lash cracked like thunder. Callahan arched, his teeth clenched. The second tore blood from his skin. By the 10th he was groaning, sagging against the ropes. Charles stood, rigid, his fists balled so tight his nails cut his palms. He wanted to look away, but he forced himself to watch. If this was the price of being caught, he had to know it. By the 40th lash, Callahan was nearly unconscious, his body hanging. Limp when the 50th blow fell, he sagged like a broken sail. The crew was dismissed, but the silence was heavier than any storm. Callahan was carried below, a ruined body that might not last the night. Charles stumbled back to his work, his head spinning. He felt the sting of salt spray on his face and could not tell if it was sea or tears. That night, in the dim of the lower deck, he sat by Callahan's hammock. The Irishman's breath rattled shallowly, his face gray. Charles whispered, "Hold on, please." But Callahan did not stir. Reeve crouched beside him. "This is the way of it," he said, his voice low and grim. "They break one to frighten the rest." His eyes glimmered in the lantern light. But fear cuts 2 ways. Sometimes it binds men tighter than chains. Charles looked up sharply. "You still mean to fight?" Reeves' jaw set. "More than ever. And now you must choose, lad. You're part of this, whether you like it or not. When the chance comes, you'll either stand with us or hang with us." The words struck deep. Charles wanted nothing more than to go home, to walk the streets of Boston again, to sit by his mother's fire, but home was a horizon away, guarded by the same men who tore flesh from Callahan's back. The following days were a blur. Work continued, but the ship was heavier with silence. Blakely strutted smugly, his eyes gleaming. Charles avoided him, though hatred burned like hot iron in his chest. At night, the pressed men whispered more urgently, their faces grim. The lash had not crushed them, it had sharpened them. On the third night, Callahan died. His body was sewn into canvas, weighted with shot, and slid into the sea. Charles stood at the rail as the bundle splashed and vanished beneath the waves. He thought of Callahan's eyes, the brief glance they had shared, the unspoken bond between captives. Charles whispered to the ocean, "I won't forget." The sea swallowed the promise. But in his heart, it burned like a brand. The breaking point had come. The lash had done its work, but not in the way the officers intended. It had not silenced the crew. It had sown rebellion. And Charles, still only 13, knew he would soon have to stand in the storm of it. The spark in the dark. The death of Callahan lingered, like smoke in every corner of the ship. His hammock was gone, but the space he left behind felt louder than cannon fire. Men moved slower, quieter, yet their eyes carried something sharp. They had seen what the lash could do. They had also seen it fail to break their will. Charles felt it most in the silence. Every clang of hammer, every creak of rope seemed to pulse with waiting. Even Blakely's strutting voice did little to pierce it. The officers thought fear had settled the crew. They were wrong. Fear was no longer chains. It was tinder. One night, as lanterns guttered low, Charles was pulled aside by Reeve. The old sailor's face was worn and shadowed, but his eyes burned. "It's time," Reeve whispered. Charles stiffened. For what? For the first blow? For Callahan? He wanted to run, to cling to some hope that obedience might yet keep him safe. But the memory of Callahan's body sinking beneath the sea dragged him back. The choice was no longer about safety. It was about survival. "How?" Charles asked, his voice thin. Reeve leaned close, his breath hot with salt and rum. "Tonight, when the watch is thin, we take the arms, chest, quiet, clean. Once we have steel, the rest will follow." Charles's heart hammered. He was 13. His hands had never held a pistol, never swung a cutlass with blood behind it. But he nodded, because he knew there was no stepping back. That night, the ship rolled gently under a cold sky. Stars spilled across the heavens, brilliant and sharp, as if watching. Lanterns swung in the rigging, casting shadows that danced along the deck. Charles moved with the others, Reeve, Burke, and 2 more pressed men. They crept like ghosts, bare feet soft on the planks. The arms chest sat under guard by a lone Marine, half asleep at his post. His musket leaned against the bulkhead, his chin sunk to his chest. Reeve drew a knife from his belt. Charles's breath caught, but before the blade could rise, Charles whispered, "Wait." He slipped forward, heart pounding, and crouched beside the Marine. "Sir," Charles whispered gently, shaking his shoulder. "Captain wants you below." The Marine stirred, confused, blinking in the dim light. Below?" Charles nodded. "Quickly, I sir," said now. Still half dreaming, the Marine stood, rubbed his eyes, and shuffled away. Reeve's hand clamped on Charles's shoulder, squeezing hard. Approval, relief. They worked fast. Reeve pried the chest open, pulling out pistols, cutlasses, and powder horns. He passed them out like bread at a feast. Charles took a pistol, its weight shocking in his small hand. He tucked it under his shirt, the cold metal pressing against his skin. "Not a sound," Reeve warned. They scattered, tucking weapons into hidden places. Charles's heart roared in his chest, but no alarm came. The ship sailed on, oblivious, while the pressed men armed themselves beneath the officers' noses. The first spark was struck at dawn. Charles went about his duties as if nothing had changed. The officers barked orders. The boatswain's whistle shrieked. Blakely sneered. But now, under every shirt and hammock, steel lay waiting. The crew's silence had teeth. 2 days passed, and the ship sighted a sail on the horizon. A merchant, fat and slow, its white canvas glowing against the sky. The captain's eyes gleamed. "We'll have her," he declared. "Ready the guns." As the frigate surged forward, Charles's stomach twisted. He could feel the shift, the press of fate. Reeve's words echoed. The first blow below deck. Men gripped hidden cutlasses. Eyes met in the half-light. Some were wide with fear, others hard with resolve. The plan was no longer whispered, it was etched into every glance, every clenched fist. Charles checked the pistol under his shirt. His hands shook. He was a boy, about to be thrust into a storm of blood and iron. But Callahan's face rose in his mind, pale and broken, and the fear burned into anger. When the guns roared, their thunder masked the first cries of rebellion. Above, deck officers shouted commands. Sailors scrambled to their stations. But in the shadows, pressed men moved differently. Ropes were cut where they should have been tied. Gunpowder was spilled where it should have been packed. Chaos crept like fire through dry grass. Reeve's voice hissed at Charles's side. "Not yet. Hold steady. When the moment comes, you'll know." The frigate bore down on the merchantman. smoke and fire belching from her guns. The crew cheered, the officers exulted, but beneath their triumph, something darker swelled. The spark had caught, and Charles, pistol hidden against his ribs, felt the fire spreading toward the heart of the ship. Fire on the deck. The guns had just fallen silent. Smoke drifted in heavy clouds across the deck, choking the air and turning the morning sun into a red smear. The merchantman, its sails shredded and hull cracked, lay crippled in the water. Officers shouted orders with the sharp pride of victory, their boots clattering across blood-slick planks. But beneath that noise, another sound rose, quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. The sound of men drawing blades from beneath their shirts. The sound of 100 breaths caught in unison, waiting for one word. Charles stood amid it all, pistol pressed tight against his ribs. He felt like he was standing on a knife's edge. His boy's heart thundered in his chest, but his hands didn't tremble. Not anymore. Reeves' voice cut through the smoke, low but fierce. Now, the deck erupted. Pressed men turned on their masters, cutlasses flashing, pistols firing. A boatswain who had whipped men without mercy dropped with a blade across his throat. An officer spun in shock as the sailor he had cursed hours before drove a knife into his belly. The frigate, moments ago a war machine, became a cauldron of chaos. Charles found himself in the center of it. A marine lunged toward him, musket raised like a club. Without thinking, Charles pulled the pistol free and fired. The blast deafened him. The recoil stung his arm, and the marine crashed backward, blood blooming across his chest. Charles stood, frozen, staring at the smoke curling from the barrel. Realizing he had crossed a line from which there was no return, Reeves seized his shoulder and shoved him forward. Move, boy. No time for ghosts. The fight was everywhere. Men swung from the rigging with ropes in hand, dropping like hawks onto officers below. Muskets cracked in the smoke. The clash of steel on steel rang across the deck, mingled with cries of rage and agony. Captain Hargreaves stormed out from the quarterdeck, pistol in one hand, saber in the other. His face was a mask of fury, his voice thundering above the storm. Mutiny, dogs, all of you, 2 arms, crush them. But his command, once absolute, fell into the sea of rebellion. Some sailors hesitated at his voice, but most pressed men surged, harder, driven by years of rage. Charles ducked under a swinging blade and scrambled across the deck, nearly slipping on blood. Esau Blakely, the midshipman, cornered by 3 mutineers. His sneer was gone, replaced by panic. He swung his cutlass wildly, shrieking for a heartbeat. Charles saw the boy Blakely truly was, not much older than himself. Fear made him human. But then Charles remembered the lash, the laughter, the way Blakely had called Callahan's death a lesson. He turned away. The cutlasses fell, and Blakely's screams ended in silence. The fight raged for what felt like hours, though it was minutes. The officers fought hard, Marines forming tight knots, muskets blazing, bayonets stabbing, but the pressed men outnumbered them, and fury gave them strength. Charles saw Reeves slash through to Marines before taking a musket ball to the shoulder. He staggered, blood running down his arm, but still roared like a beast. Burke wrestled, a lieutenant to the ground, the two rolling in the muck until Burke's knife found its mark. It was brutal, close and merciless. Charles found himself face to face with Captain Hargreaves. The man loomed, saber dripping, eyes burning with cold fire. "You," the captain growled, "the whelp, this is your doing." Charles raised his pistol, hands steady now. His voice was no louder than a whisper. "No, this is yours." He pulled the trigger. The pistol clicked empty. For a breath, nothing. Then Hargreaves roared and raised his saber high. Before the blade could fall, Reeves slammed into the captain, driving him back. The two men crashed against the rail, grappling, steel flashing in the sun. Charles scrambled to his feet, grabbing a cutlass from the deck. He charged, swinging with every ounce of his small body. The blade caught Hargreaves across the arm, blood spraying. The captain staggered, eyes wide with shock. Reeves shoved him once more, hard, and Hargreaves toppled over the rail, crashing into the sea below. The water swallowed him, his saber still clutched in his hand. Silence fell. It spread, slowly, like a wave. The Marines who still stood lowered their muskets. The officers who lived threw down their blades. The deck, painted in blood and smoke, belonged now to the mutineers. Reeve, pale and bleeding, turned to Charles. "It's done," he rasped. "By God, boy, you did it." Charles looked at the sea where Hargreaves had vanished, then down at his blood-stained hands. The ship was theirs, but the weight of what they had unleashed pressed heavy on his chest. For freedom, a price had been paid in blood.